So firstly, I'd argue that it means that the most so-called undesirable migrants, which are seemingly undesirable because they're unproductive, or bogus refugees, non-status migrants, a lot of elders who are sponsored under the family class, all of these are facing increased repression. So the stats that I was talking about earlier, those decreasing targets. So it means that people are being kept out of the so-called front door while they're also being booted out of the so-called back door. And the human impact of this is quite severe. These are just the two public cases that we know of, but an Eritrean refugee committed suicide in Halifax in March 2010 from fear of a pending deportation. In December 2008, a 24-year-old woman was deported to Mexico where she was murdered, and she had applied for asylum in Canada twice. And this tragedy occurred while Kenya was imposing visa requirements on Mexico, saying that all Mexican migrants were basically bogus refugee claimants. So on the flip side, we have business class investors and highly skilled immigrants who are being fast-tracked, for example, through the Canadian Experience class. So that's what it means for the segments of so-called undesirable migrants. Secondly, I would argue that Canada's increasing shift to temporary worker programs means that exploitative conditions for migrants has become entrenched. So immigrants are basically becoming cash cows and are coming to serve labor market needs, essentially. And it ensures that they exist in, as I mentioned earlier, conditions of long hours, low pay, lack of basic health and safety standards, denial of basic entitlements, including unemployment benefits and social assistance, and constant fear of deportation by employers. And one thing is that under the SPP, I don't have time to talk about the SPP, but hopefully people know the Security and Prosperity Partnership Agreement, which is kind of NAFTA plus Homeland Security. One of the models that the US points to is Canada's foreign worker program, right? Canada points to the seasonal agriculture, the US points to Canada's seasonal agricultural worker program as the model to implement. So we have to realize that, it's really easy in Canada to have this idea that the immigration system in Canada is broken and that we need to fix it. But I would argue that the Canadian system of immigration is perfect for the needs it is supposed to serve. It's supposed to serve the needs of labor flexibility and racism and ensure a class of migrants that are exploited. And so the reason that we don't see the kind of massive debates that are happening in the US is because Canada has, to a level, perfected its model of containment and expulsion. And that there's a highly selected group of diaspora that we can point to when we want to talk about multiculturalism, and at the same time deport all of the people that are undesirables, right? And so this kind of deportspora, as Peter Nair calls it, exists parallel to this highly selectively picked diaspora that we can, that all these leaders point to when they want to talk about multiculturalism. And so this isn't a coincidence in terms of the third point, which is that I think that all of these changes reflect an increasing rise in racism in Canada, and it kind of harks back to this ideology of white Canada. And what temporary workers ensure, in addition to labor flexibility, is that it legalizes the foreignness of temporary workers, right? You're always a quote-unquote foreign worker. That very name suggests that people who are migrant workers, who work alongside us, who live alongside us, are foreign. They aren't part of us. And it legalizes that kind of endemic racism by just creating a program and saying, this is the reason that we can discriminate against them, and we can legalize this discrimination and this apartheid against them. And this is something that, again, Canada has a history of, right? Since the Chinese railway workers were brought in. And every time there is kind of this crisis, whether it's during Pearl Harbor where Japanese Canadians were interned, right now with the War on Terror, when Arab, South Asian, Muslim Canadians are being stereotyped and racially profiled, and anti-terror legislation most deeply impacts them, it's a way to designate all these communities as not Canadian enough, right? As hyphenated citizens who are Japanese Canadian, South Asian Canadian, Muslim Canadian, but not Canadian enough. And when the opportunity arises, it allows for these communities to be targeted and often expelled. So I think, those are some of the reasons to challenge Jason Kenney, even though he is the public face, but again, he's not the sole reason or the root cause of these policies. But because he is so vocally behind these policies and is so willing to defend such repression, Known as Legal in Vancouver has launched a People versus Jason Kenney campaign. And I'd encourage you to check out some of the materials that are outside. So I want to conclude by reiterating, which is what the preface of my talk was, which is that, we're talking about Jason Kenney, but we have to assert that no one is illegal, the system is illegal, and that in fact Canada is illegal. And a quote from a detainee that I want to read to you is, quote, "Beyond the fences, the cages, these walls, beyond these gates, alarms, and cameras, there is no place that I am seeking anymore. I no longer believe there is a humanitarian Canada. Immoral laws may be legal, but the slaves will rebel. Everyone is caged, whether here or there, whether now or later. Today me, maybe tomorrow someone else. Revolutionaries, historians, mothers, humans, all queue jumpers, as if we were all born by waiting in some line, end quote. So, in terms of what we have to demand, I think, it's, we have to get rid of Jason Kenney, but much beyond that, we have to demand an end to all detentions and deportations. We have to demand the abolition of temporary worker programs. They can't be reformed, they have to be abolished, because at their very core, they allow and facilitate exploitation. We have to, beyond that, also demand workers' control over their own production and not corporate wage slave conditions that devalues human beings, especially women. We have to demand status for all, particularly those who've been deemed illegal, in order to justify the theft of their labor. And from Turtle Island to Afghanistan, we have to demand the dismantling of Fortress North America and its border security pacts, as well as the global military industry, both of which create and justify fear and repression. Canada and its economy are built on the theft of Indigenous lands, exploitation of labor, especially slave, migrant, and reproductive labor, and the appropriation of natural resources locally and globally. This ongoing apartheid reality, which is instituted through reserves and sweatshops, is one that must be fundamentally uprooted and transformed. I think we have to envision a humanity where people are able to provide sustenance for themselves and be able to live in a society where that sustenance is enough to meet their basic needs. And to be able to live in relationships that are meaningful to one another, not ones that are filled with exploitation and oppression. And because we're talking about the G20, or we're in this context of talking about the G20 and the mobilizations this week, I think it specifically means, for no one is legal, that we're asserting that we stand alongside Indigenous defenders, that we're standing alongside migrant and non-status people, that we're standing alongside homeless communities, alongside working class communities, and we're standing alongside anti-war activists. I think we have to make clear that the violence of capitalism and colonization cannot be reformed. The G8, the G20 cannot be reformed. The G8 and the G20 need to be shut down. And I think I want to reiterate what Jaggi was saying about this fence, the atrocity of this fence, which is a symbolism, I think. It's a physical symbolism, it's an ideological symbolism of global apartheid, of corporate greed, about the ways in which the elite and the bankers are able to hide behind these fences that are guarded by $1 billion and a massive security and police apparatus. That this fence needs to be taken down. All of the fences and all of the cages that are going up in Toronto need to be taken down. And I would urge all of us to organize, rather than with fear in our hearts, that we organize with freedom in our hearts. Thank you.